Hi, all. This is Dr. Reynolds again. Welcome back. This week we're wrapping up the Sophists or the Sophists. Either way is fine. So I just want to give you a quick overview of everyone we've talked about and what we're covering this week. Okay. So in this talk, just really quickly, we'll go over again who are the Sophists. We've talked about them already a couple of times, but then I'm going to go through the major figures and works that we have discussed, um, so that we have a clear idea of who we're talking about and how all these very different people are grouped together in different ways based on the people who are writing about them later. So in things like Isocrates against the Sophists, or in Plato's works that condemn particular speakers and group them together as Sophists. Okay, so here we go. First, who were the Sophists? Of course, we've discussed the Sophists were itinerant teachers in ancient Greece during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. They specialized in teaching rhetoric, philosophy, and other subjects for a fee, oftentimes focusing on the art of persuasive argumentation and achieving arete. Arete, we talked about last week. Maybe that means civic excellence, or whether that means civic virtue, and how we kind of navigate um, the way the Sophists talk about virtue as opposed to the way that other people talk about virtue, which of course eventually the Sophists gain a negative connotation due to Plato's and Aristotle's claims that they emphasized winning debates over finding objective truth. And this idea of kind of what is the goal of philosophy and rhetoric as part of, or connected to, or separate from philosophy. The term sophistry, of course, now refers to intellectually dishonest arguments or clever but deceptive reasoning. So you can see how how Plato and Aristotle's attacks on the sophists persisted in our vocabulary. All right. So we haven't really talked about Protagoras much. You've read about Protagoras. But Protagoras is the earliest known sophist. He taught poetry and public speaking. He was from Thrace, which I didn't include a map this time, but Thrace would be in the northeastern region of the Mediterranean. So previous, the Ionians were kind of right across the Mediterranean. If you just kind of go north of there, part of that is Turkey, part of that I think is Bulgaria nowadays. But he would have come from that area. All that remain of his writings are fragments and discussions of him by others, most notably Plato, whose dialogue Protagoras, which we'll read later, explicitly attacks the sophists and rhetoric itself. According to Protagoras, rhetoric can be understood as the art of persuasion, where the most effective speech is not necessarily the one that presents absolute truth, but rather the one that is most tailored to the specific situation and audience. So utilizing the ability to argue both sides of an issue to demonstrate the nuances of a topic, something we often call anti-logic. And so the dissoi logoi, which we'll talk about in a minute, is very representative of how we believe Protagoras thought about rhetoric, and using this idea of anti-logic to be able to argue kind of any side of any topic. There are a couple of really famous fragments. The one, man is the measure of all things. So of all things, the measure is man. Of all things that they are, and of all things that are not, that they are not. This implies that for Protagoras, truth is relative to the individual's perception. So the best argument is the one that best resonates with the listener, regardless of an absolute truth, right? So there seems to be no absolute truth from this perspective. Instead, truth is what each individual understands it to be. So if we want to convince our audience, we need to understand what they believe and convince them based on those terms. So very audience aware. Protagoras emphasized the ability to construct compelling arguments and adapt them to different situations, making rhetoric a valuable tool for civic engagement and debate. As a prominent sophist, Protagoras saw rhetoric as a skill to be honed for persuasion in public discourse, particularly in legal settings. So another one of his fragments on the gods. So about the gods, I'm not able to know whether they exist or do not exist, nor what they are like in form, for the factors preventing knowledge are many, the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life. This is the idea that that we talked about earlier with the rise of kind of proto-science is also a rise in atheism, and in this case, right, not necessarily atheism, but a recognition of the impossibility to know or understand the gods, and so why spend time working on them? So that gives you an idea of kind of Protagoras as the oldest sophist that we know about. There may have been many others. Um, and we can see the ideas of relativism already clearly presented in just these little fragments. Okay. The dissoi logoi, which we read last week, defined rhetoric as a practice of presenting and arguing both sides of an issue, or really any side of an issue is a better way to think about it. But dissoi logoi can actually mean opposing arguments or contrasting arguments. But essentially demonstrates the ability to construct compelling arguments for opposing viewpoints, and highlighting the idea that any topic can be argued from multiple perspectives, and that truth, rather than being absolute and fixed, can be multifaceted. So this concept was central to the teaching of the Sophists, who believed in the power of persuasive discourse, even when arguing seemingly contradictory positions. It's important to note that for a while, for years, it was believed the dissoi logoi was written by Protagoras. Now that is no longer the belief, but we do think it's representative of his approach to rhetoric. So dissoi logoi literally means contrasting arguments in Greek, and the method was a key part of the training of the Sophists, who would often argue both sides of the debate to demonstrate the rhetorical skill and their ability to persuade an audience regardless of the truth of the position. By exploring both sides of an argument, the practice of dissoi logoi also encourages deeper thinking and understanding of complex issues. So we see this practice being used in contemporary classrooms, right? Like, let's think about what are the opposing arguments so we can understand them and those other perspectives as a way to better understand complex issues and how to make our own arguments in response to them. So we haven't lost this practice, but we've lost, in many ways, the foundational idea behind it. And that is that a good rhetor should be able to argue pretty much any side of any argument, at least according to the Sophists. We see this, of course, in the work of Gorgias, which we read last week. So Protagoras, as I mentioned, will read a dialogue called Protagoras, written by Plato, but Plato's student Aristotle also criticized Protagoras' relativism and the doctrine of appearances, arguing that they violated the principle of non-contradiction, which I'll talk about in a minute. Non-contradiction is the idea that Aristotle believed logically that nothing that is true can also be false. And of course, that flies in direct face of what the Sophists argued. That is, that you should be able to argue both sides of that it is both true and false. Aristotle believed that Protagoras' views made it impossible to know the truth, and he was interested not only in winning arguments, but also in knowing the truth. So Aristotle believed that Protagoras' relativism was based on whether or how individuals perceived things rather than how individuals thought about things. Aristotle argued then that Protagoras' doctrine of appearances was false because it led to the conclusion that all things are one, right? So if everything is both true and false, both good and bad, both all these contradictory things, then really they're only one thing, and that one thing is contradictory. And Aristotle was a big classifier of knowledge, and he didn't like this idea. And so he basically says, like, Protagoras' doctrine of appearance is entirely false. Just because we might see things or understand things as true that are false doesn't mean they actually are false, right? That they are still only always true or false, not both. Aristotle argued that conflicting appearances are often caused instead by perceptual mistakes or a lack of normal conditions for perception. Because Aristotle wanted to make it clear that thinking and perceiving must be distinct. That we perceive the world, but then we can think about it and determine whether things are true or false, and not be fooled by the appearance of things. We read Gorgias last week, and we'll read a dialogue by Plato as well when we get to Plato. But according to Plato's dialogue, Gorgias defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion, essentially viewing it as a powerful tool to influence opinions, beliefs, and actions through speech, with a focus on the ability to persuade audiences in political settings like courts and assemblies, thereby improving one's social and political standing. He considered it the greatest of human concerns, right? So rhetoric was really important for Gorgias and a source of personal freedom and power over others. So Gorgias primarily saw rhetoric as a means to persuade an audience, not necessarily about absolute truth again, right? So like Protagoras and like the Disoilogoi. He believed rhetoric was crucial for navigating political situations and influencing decisions. And he highlighted the importance and the potential of rhetoric to give individuals power and control over others. And this is something that is scary for Plato, right? He recognizes the power of language to have, like, it's powerful and it can move others and get them to do things that perhaps are not in their best interest, right? So he is highly critical of Gorgias. Gorgias, we have the encomio of Helen. We also have a defense of the Palamedes, but we have some other fragments. Here we see on the board one on the non-existent. So first and foremost, nothing exists. Second, even if it exists, it is inapprehensible to man. Third, even if it is apprehensible, still it is without a doubt incapable of being expressed or explained to the next man. So we can see how, similar to Protagoras' comment on the gods, Gorgias' comment on kind of what we mean when we talk about existence, like that thing that is. Right. First and foremost, he says that nothing really exists. The only thing that really exists is our individual perceptions of it. And so we don't ever really get to whatever really exists, even because we can't. Right. We can never get beyond our individual experience and our individual understanding. But he said, second, even if we were actually getting to something rather than nothing, that we still, and we could actually, like, even if there was something and we could actually get to it, that still we wouldn't be able to explain it in a way that other people will be able to understand it. So he's saying, like, there are no absolute truths. And even if there are absolute truths, it doesn't matter because we are limited as humans in our ability to communicate those and understand those. You can see how this perspective differs significantly from a theistic perspective based on the gods, and the gods is representing something as opposed to nothing, or the idea of nature as something that actually underlies out there that we are all experiencing perhaps in different ways, but it still would be itself out there. And philosophers like Plato believe that if we really, really worked, we could get to that universal truth, that big T truth. And theistic people, of course, believe that if you can get closer to God, you can get to that absolute truth. Gorgias is rejecting that completely, right? So here we see that atheism in full force. Some important things to note about Gorgias is he was well known for being an excellent orator, and some of the figures of speech are still associated with him, and they're all related to parallelism. So he liked this idea of making the text fit together in some kind of natural and eloquent way. Antithesis, or juxtaposing contrasting words or ideas, like if loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right, is a good example of that. Anadiplosis, which is repetition of the last word at the beginning of the next sentence or line. So you might say, I know what love, or I know this is love. Love is when we feel this way, right? So the repetition of love. Homoi otel leoton. I'm sure I said that not in the greatest, most smooth way I could have, but that's ending parallel words in the same way. So sweetly, deeply, lovingly, right? All those end with the ly. So kind of paying attention to the way we end words to make them feel like they go together. And then the isocolon, which is parallel elements having the same length. And this is something that's still relevant in kind of books like The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, where there's a lot of emphasis on parallelism to make your writing more cohesive. The other, really, the biggest thing that carries over from Gorgias is this idea of kairos, and kairos becomes important for a lot of the Sophists, and because they're interested in oratory, they're interested in like when to speak and when not to speak, and how to measure your speaking so it fits the moment. Kairos is this idea of the appropriate timing for the occasion. In Homer's Iliad, Kairos is that moment when the enemy's armor opens during natural movement. So somebody's fighting, so they lift their arms to swing a sword or throw a spear, that maybe the plates of their armor come slightly apart, which makes an opening for an arrow to slide through and kill that person. So it's kind of like that. It's the perfect moment. You can think about Kairos as that. Kairos is the moment. So Gorgias was really interested in paying attention to what's that moment to speak, and how do I appropriately speak in that moment to have my maximum effect on my audience. Okay. We also read Antiphon. Antiphon was interesting in this time because he represents rhetoric as it shifts from orality towards writing. So away from just thinking about public speaking as something you do impromptu in the moment, through preparation, of course, right? You would practice about how to make all these different arguments so you could kind of save up in your mind, well, if this kind of argument comes up, here's my example I can use to demonstrate that. Or if this argument comes up, here's the technique I can use to address that. So when we say impromptu, we don't just mean like on the fly. We instead mean on the fly with lots of preparation, right? But Antiphon was a logographos, which means he was a speech writer. He viewed rhetoric as the art of constructing persuasive arguments by utilizing contrasting viewpoints and exploring the probability of different scenarios. So like the distoi logoi, we see this demonstrated through his tetralogies, and he was notably Athenian. That means he was born in Athens. So unlike the previous Sophists who were interested in, or were itinerant teachers who came from abroad to Athens to teach, he was actually taught in Athens and then became a teacher of rhetoric or a rhetorician. And he's one of what we call the 10 Attic orators. Attic means from Athens, and they adopted a simpler style as compared to the previous ones. So Gorgias, who is famous for his big style, his grand style, we have the Attic orators who used a simpler, more practical style. We see Antiphon's speech writing in court cases primarily. He wrote tetralogies where he presented arguments from both sides of a hypothetical legal case, showcasing his focus on logical reasoning and the manipulation of evidence to sway an audience. And we see there are 3 complete tetralogies that are extant. So if you're interested in this kind of rhetoric, you could take a look at it. Each has 4 arguments, 2 that blame and 2 that defend. And he employs the sophistic method of presenting opposing arguments, or that anti-logic or antilogia, to present a situation from multiple perspectives, highlighting the complexity of truth in legal disputes. Antiphon emphasized the concept of ecos, or probability, in his arguments, suggesting that the most likely explanations should be considered when evaluating a case. His most famous works are those tetralogies, those collections of legal cases, but he also left us, as we know, with other extant writings that include political speeches, like we read on truth, right? As a logographer, Antiphon primarily wrote speeches for others to deliver in court, indicating his practical application of rhetoric in legal settings of the time, and how he could make a living in that way and become kind of a famous teacher in that way. Alcidamas, we're reading this week. According to Alcidamas, rhetoric is primarily the ability to speak extemporaneously, meaning to deliver speeches without a prepared written text, emphasizing the power of spontaneous, adaptable speech in the moment rather than relying on a fixed written document. He believed that was the most effective way to persuade an audience and respond to changing situations in a live debate. In other words, right, while all these legographers, with the rise of the written word and literacy among the Athenians, we see more people writing those speeches that people would give in to blame others or in defense of themselves in the courts or to argue in the assemblies for a particular course of action or against a particular course of action. Alcidamas, like Protagoras and Gorgias, was really interested in maintaining that ability to speak because it's all about kairos. It's all about finding that right moment to say the right thing. So if what you're doing is just delivering a fixed speech, you're missing out on that opportunity to really persuade in that way. He argued that spoken speech is inherently superior to written text because it allows for greater flexibility and adaptation to the audience and the situation, right? We never know our actual audience in an oral situation until we're actually in front of them, and that audience may appear to be one thing but change in the course of the discussion, and not being stuck to a script allows you to adapt your message. Likewise, the situation can change in the same way. Alcidamas considered the ability to speak impromptu on any topic to be the highest goal of an orator. So that means a lot of preparation so that whatever topic comes up, the orator is able to speak on it. He characterized the practice of writing out speeches beforehand, claiming it could lead to a stilted delivery and a lack of responsiveness to the audience. All right. Isocrates, who we'll also read this week, was an Athenian orator who lived between the 5th and 4th centuries. He defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion, or the science of words, he called it. He believed rhetoric was a practical skill that should be used to improve society. Rhetoric then is the use of reason, feeling, and imagination to persuade others. For Isocrates, rhetoric was a branch of philosophy that could change how people perceive things, right? So he's still talking about that issue of perception, and Plato will certainly take issue with the fact that Isocrates and the other Sophists considered rhetoric to be part of philosophy rather than separate from it, because rhetoric is interested in the probable and the possible, whereas philosophy for scholars like Plato are using philosophy to try to get at truth, right, as something kind of fixed and universal. For Isocrates, rhetoric was a useful tool in everyday life, particularly in public affairs, and he believed it was a skill that could be developed through natural talent and practical experience. So here is this idea coming up of that there are some people who have a natural talent for rhetoric, and that the job of the teacher of rhetoric is to take that natural talent and give that student the practical experience so that they can develop that talent to make it useful. This is particularly interesting for Isocrates because he was famous for being very soft-spoken, having a very quiet voice, and therefore was not a great orator, not a great speaker, but was considered one of the greatest legographers or speech writers of his time. Enough so he was able to open his own school. And his own school then was a fixed place rather than the way the itinerant teachers had previously kind of gone home to home. He actually opened his own school. He said rhetoric should be used by people with developed consciences. So he starts to think about like what is the goal of rhetoric? What does he mean by developed conscience? Well, that you're aware of the things you're deciding and what is the best course of action. So we stop thinking just about winning and start thinking about doing what is right or good or best for the society in which you live. Isocrates famously worked with small groups of students, usually 8 or 9. They studied texts, they imitated the text, they discussed his orations, his example text, to kind of learn how to make those texts themselves. They would learn to write compellingly and elegantly on important political topics of the time. And the goal ultimately of Isocrates' educational system was to produce not only people who could win arguments like the previous sophists, but was to produce morally good, thoughtful, and articulate citizens so that those people could actually make a better society. I apologize, there's a little bump there. I hit the forward button too many times and missed this screen, so I had to go back. Okay, so we're not going to talk about Demosthenes right now, but Demosthenes was an Athenian statesman and orator. He used rhetoric to persuade people to oppose Philip of Macedon, and then later his son Alexander the Great. So this is the Lamian War, which comes after the Peloponnesian and then the Civil War. Things seem to be doing okay, and then the Athenians recognize that Philip of Macedon, the Macedonians, are their greatest threat. And while they might have been able to have some kind of treaty beforehand, Demosthenes said, no, we need to stand up and fight. And he was able to motivate people to fight what would ultimately be a terrible war for the Athenians. But he was known for his use of collective memory, gestures, and voice to project his ideas and arguments in such a persuasive way that for example, he was able to raise armies of citizens who knew that they stood no chance to fend off the Macedonians. So what is collective memory? Well, collective memory, he reminded the Athenians of their values and their virtuous past action. He basically said, like the Athenians, we're the greatest of all people. We can't allow these barbarians from outside, the Macedonians, to come and just take over, right? He was famous for really putting himself into the giving of speeches, so not just saying eloquent words or being clever, but also using his body to accentuate his words, using his voice to make his ideas and arguments more forceful. And he used, like what I mentioned before, Attic prose, which was a style of oratory that was unadorned, so considered kind of plain style as opposed to the older Sophists focus on a grand or ornate style. So fewer figures of speech, more practical use of words. He really focused on delivery as more important than style when he was giving those speeches. He learned to give speeches by studying the speeches of previous great orators, and in fact delivered his first judicial speeches at the age of 20, we know from histories of the time. He was regarded as a great orator by the other orators of his time. Cicero called him the perfect orator, and Quintilian described him as setting a standard for all orators. Unfortunately, being a great orator doesn't mean you always make the right decisions, and that was certainly the case for Demosthenes, who convinced the Greeks to go to war with the Macedonians, and then thought they kind of won a victory when Philip was murdered. But then his son, who became Alexander the Great, went on to conquer not only Athens but all of what was then the Greek Empire and the Persian Empire, right? Building a much larger empire than had ever existed before. So there we see kind of the power that the Sophists had, right? But we can also see how different these Sophists were, right? So from the really early Sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias, who really rejected this idea of absolute truth, or the idea that we can know anything kind of philosophically beyond what is right in front of us, what is practical. And so you see this focus on relativism, this focus on what is practical, this focus on talking about what is possible and probable rather than what is true or untrue. And we see that then grow in different ways, right? So we maintain this kind of relativistic perspective, but see that adapted to particular ends, whether that's in legal areas or in deliberative rhetoric in the assemblies, until we get to somebody like Isocrates, who's actually interested, okay, so maybe there isn't this absolute truth that we're after, but there is this kind of civic good or best, right? And so how that idea of civic virtue or arete changes for different sophists. We also see the rise of writing and how that changes the way we think about speech giving. And we'll see how Plato and Aristotle, who are going to wrap up our discussion of the Greeks, really finish that or bring all that home, because they're going to spend some time critiquing those previous writers, the Sophists that we think of, both the older Sophists, right, but also these newer ideas and what is the role of writing. So I look forward to seeing that. Before we do that, next week we're going to talk about the women in ancient Greece and where they fit in as orators and rhetoricians as well. But for now, enjoy your reading this week. I think it's going to gets more and more entertaining as we get to more texts that tell stories and are less and are maybe more developed. We have more extant texts, fewer fragments to work from. So let me know, as always, if you have any questions. Have a great week.